The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Galactic Academy Station 7, where students from dozens of species mingled between classes. Zektar pulled his thin arms closer to his chest as he walked, his pale blue skin almost translucent in the artificial light. His large dark eyes scanned the crowd nervously, hoping to reach his next class without incident. The Velkin boy was smaller than most students here, even smaller than many of the younger ones. His species had evolved on a low-gravity world, making them naturally slight and delicate compared to the robust physiques of species like the Thoraxians or Grimaldi. At 15 standard years old, Zektar barely reached the shoulder height of his peers. His data pad and study materials were clutched tightly against his chest as he navigated through the bustling corridor. Mathematics had always been his strength, the one subject where his mind could soar beyond the limitations of his fragile body. Today's advanced quantum mechanics class was something he had been looking forward to all week. Well, look what we have here. A deep, rumbling voice called out behind him. Zektar's blood turned cold. He recognized that voice immediately. Thraxon, a massive Thoraxian student who stood nearly 3 meters tall, with chitinous plates covering his muscular frame. Behind him followed his usual companions, 2 Grimaldi twins whose rocky, mineral-based bodies made them look like walking boulders. The little Velkin thinks he belongs in advanced classes. Thraxon sneered, his mandibles clicking with amusement. Other students began to slow their pace, some stopping entirely to watch what was about to unfold. Zektar had learned long ago that expecting help from bystanders was futile. Most species viewed the Velkins as weak, almost parasitic in their need for assistance with basic physical tasks. "Please," Zektar whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just want to get to class." "Oh, you want to get to class?" Thraxon's laugh was like grinding metal. "But look at you carrying all those heavy books. That must be so difficult for someone so delicate." Before Zektar could react, one of the Grimaldi twins reached out with a massive stone hand and knocked the datapad from his arms. The device clattered to the floor, followed by his carefully organized study notes which scattered across the walkway like fallen leaves. "Oops," the twin said in a voice like grinding rocks. "How clumsy of me." Zektar dropped to his knees immediately, desperately trying to gather his materials. His notes were getting trampled by passing students who either didn't notice or didn't care. The datapad had skidded several meters away, dangerously close to a drainage grate. "Look at him crawl," Thraxon said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Just like the insect he is. Maybe if you crawl fast enough, little Velkin, you might still make it to class before it ends." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Some students looked uncomfortable but did nothing. Others openly laughed or made crude jokes about Velkin weakness. A few recorded the incident on their personal devices, no doubt to share later for entertainment. Zektar's hands shook as he reached for his scattered papers. His eyes burned with unshed tears, but he had learned long ago that crying only made things worse. The bullies fed on any sign of emotional response. His thin fingers scraped against the rough flooring as he crawled forward, chasing after papers that seemed to drift further away with each gust of air from the ventilation system. "This is pathetic," one of the Grimaldi twins muttered. "My people used to hunt Velkins for sport before they joined the Galactic Council." "Maybe we should bring back the old traditions," Thraxon replied, his voice dripping with malice. Zektar's datapad was almost within reach when Thraxon's massive foot came down next to it, the impact sending vibrations through the floor. The Thoraxian deliberately stepped over the device, forcing Zektar to crawl around his leg to retrieve it. "Excuse me," Zektar whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "What was that?" Thraxon cupped one of his audio receptors with an exaggerated gesture. "I can't hear insects when they whisper." The humiliation was complete. Zektar remained on his hands and knees, surrounded by the scattered remains of his academic life, while dozens of students watched his degradation with varying degrees of amusement and indifference. His small frame trembled not just from fear, but from the crushing weight of his own helplessness. This was his reality at Galactic Academy. Despite his brilliant mind and perfect academic record, he was seen as nothing more than entertainment for those strong enough to take what they wanted. The galaxy might have evolved beyond many forms of prejudice, but the law of physical dominance still ruled in places like this. As Zektar finally managed to reach his data pad, he could hear Thraxzone and his friends planning their next move. They weren't finished with him yet. They never were. Marcus Chen had been observing the scene from across the courtyard for the past few minutes. The 17-year-old human student stood roughly average height for his species at 1.8 meters, with dark hair and calm brown eyes that missed very little. He had been reviewing notes for his next class when the commotion caught his attention. Humans were still relatively new to the Galactic Academy system. Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 15 years ago, and human students remained a curiosity to many species. Marcus was part of the third generation of human students to attend the prestigious institution, and he had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of interspecies education. What he was witnessing now, however, went far beyond normal social friction. The Velkin boy on the ground was clearly in distress, crawling around trying to collect his scattered belongings while three much larger students loomed over him, like predators playing with wounded prey. Marcus had heard about the Velkins during his xenobiology classes. Peaceful people from a low-gravity world who possessed remarkable intellectual capabilities despite their physical limitations. "This is getting boring," he heard one of the bullies say. "Maybe we should accidentally step on some of these papers." Marcus closed his own data pad and began walking toward the group. He moved with the easy confidence that came from growing up in Earth's standard gravity, which was higher than most civilized worlds. His muscles, bones, and cardiovascular system had been forged in what many species considered a hostile environment. As he approached, Marcus could see more details of the situation. The Velkin boy was even smaller than he had initially appeared, probably no more than 1.3 meters tall and incredibly thin. His pale blue skin had taken on an even paler shade, and his large dark eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and resigned acceptance that no help would come. The three bullies were impressive specimens of their respective species. The lead Thoraxian stood nearly twice Marcus's height, with natural armor plating that could probably deflect small arms fire. The two Grimaldi twins looked like they could punch through solid rock with their bare hands, which they probably could given their mineral-based physiology. Under normal circumstances, most species would consider this an impossible mismatch. Humans were known to be sturdy compared to some species, but they lacked the specialized advantages that evolution had granted others. They had no natural armor, no enhanced strength, no environmental adaptations that made them obviously superior in combat. What many species failed to understand about humans, however, was that they had been shaped by a world that tried to kill them in countless ways. They had evolved not just to survive, but to thrive in the face of overwhelming odds through intelligence, adaptability, and sheer bloody-minded determination. Marcus stopped just outside the circle of onlookers and assessed the situation more carefully. The Velkin boy had managed to gather most of his papers, but the bullies were clearly preparing for the next phase of their entertainment. The Thoraxian was flexing his mandibles in a way that suggested increasing aggression, while the Grimaldi twins were shifting their weight like fighters preparing to strike. "Hey," Marcus called out in a clear, carrying voice that immediately drew attention from the crowd. The Thoraxian turned toward him, his compound eyes reflecting surprise and annoyance at the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, human. Keep walking." "Actually, it does concern me," Marcus replied calmly, continuing his approach until he stood at the edge of the circle. "I'm concerned about a fellow student being prevented from getting to class." A murmur ran through the crowd. Most students had never seen a human directly confront Thoraxian aggression before. The species were known for their warrior culture and hair-trigger tempers when challenged. "You want to make this your problem?" Thraxon asked, rising to his full height and spreading his arms in an intimidation display that had probably terrified countless opponents. Marcus looked up at the massive alien with no visible sign of fear or intimidation. His expression remained calm, almost curious, as if he were observing an interesting scientific phenomenon, rather than facing down a creature that could literally tear him apart. "I'm making it my choice," Marcus said simply. The Velkin boy, still on his knees gathering papers, looked up at Marcus with shock and confusion. In his experience, other students either ignored his suffering or actively participated in it. The concept of someone voluntarily stepping forward to help was so foreign that he couldn't immediately process what was happening. Marcus could see the hope beginning to kindle in those large, dark eyes, mixed with fear that this intervention might only make things worse. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of smaller kids back on Earth who had been cornered by bullies. The expression was universal across species lines. The human student reached into his backpack and pulled out his own data pad and study materials. The crowd watched in confused silence as he knelt down next to the Velkin boy and began helping him organize the scattered papers. "Use mine," Marcus said quietly, offering his notes to the trembling alien. "My handwriting might be terrible, but the information is solid." For a moment, the entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Nobody had expected this response. The bullies had been prepared for confrontation, submission, or retreat. They had not been prepared for simple, direct kindness in the face of their aggression. Thraxon's mandibles clicked rapidly in confusion and growing anger at being ignored. Thraxon's confusion quickly transformed into rage at being ignored. In Thraxian culture, direct challenges to authority demanded immediate and decisive response. The human's casual dismissal of his dominance was not just disrespectful but incomprehensible. "I said this doesn't concern you," the massive alien roared, his voice echoing off the courtyard walls. Marcus continued organizing papers with methodical precision, not bothering to look up. "And I said it does concern me. We seem to disagree." The simple statement sent ripples of shock through the watching crowd. No one spoke to Thraxians that way, especially not smaller species. Even among warrior cultures, Thraxians were respected for their combat prowess and feared for their notorious tempers. One of the Grimaldi twins stepped forward. His rock-like features twisted into what might have been a grin. "Human, you clearly don't understand what you're dealing with. Thraxon here won the Junior Combat Championships 3 years running. He could break you in half without effort." "Probably," Marcus agreed conversationally, finally standing up and facing the 3 bullies. "But that would require him to actually touch me, which creates some interesting legal complications." Zektar scrambled to his feet beside Marcus, clutching the human's notes like a lifeline. He had never seen anyone respond to Thraxian aggression with such casual indifference. Most species, including his own, had evolved sophisticated submission behaviors specifically to avoid triggering Thraxian rage responses. "Legal complications?" Thraxon's laugh was harsh and grinding. "You think the disciplinary committee cares about one dead human?" "Oh, they probably don't," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "But the Terran Defense Corps definitely would." The courtyard went dead silent. Every student present knew about the Terran Defense Corps, though most had never seen them in action. Humans might be newcomers to galactic civilization, but their military forces had quickly earned a reputation that made even hardened warrior species uncomfortable. "The TDC doesn't get involved in student disputes," one of the Grimaldi twins said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "True," Marcus nodded, "but they do get very interested when human citizens are killed in what they classify as honor culture violence. Something about setting precedents for how humans are treated in multi-species environments." Thraxon's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this information. The Thraxian Empire had maintained careful diplomatic relations with Earth precisely because human military doctrine was so alien and unpredictable. Where most species followed established rules of engagement and territorial dispute, humans had a disturbing tendency to escalate conflicts in ways that defied conventional military wisdom. "You're bluffing," Thraxon said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Maybe," Marcus shrugged, "but are you willing to find out? Because I guarantee you if something happens to me here, the Corps won't just file a diplomatic protest. They'll send investigators to determine whether this represents a pattern of systematic targeting of human students." The implications of that statement rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. A TDC investigation would mean scrutiny of the Academy's entire disciplinary system, interviews with every student and faculty member, and potentially massive diplomatic consequences for any species found to be participating in systematic harassment. Zektar watched this exchange with growing amazement. The human wasn't just standing up to the bullies. He was using their own aggressive instincts against them by reframing the situation from a simple dominance display into a complex political issue. Marcus had transformed the power dynamic entirely. "This is ridiculous," one of the Grimaldi twins muttered. "It's just a human and a Velkin. Why are we even talking about this?" "Because," Marcus said calmly, The Galactic Council specifically established these academies as neutral ground where all species could learn together without fear of predation or harassment. When you prevent another student from attending class through intimidation, you're not just bullying an individual. You're violating the fundamental principles that allow this institution to exist. Several students in the crowd began nodding slowly. Marcus was articulating something many of them had felt, but never been able to express. The academy was supposed to be different from the often brutal realities of interspecies politics, a place where intellectual merit mattered more than evolutionary advantages. Thraxon's eyes narrowed as he realized he was losing control of the situation. The crowd was no longer simply watching entertainment. They were evaluating his actions against larger principles. Worse, the human was making him look like the aggressor in a situation where he had initially held all the advantages. "Fine," the Thraxian snarled. "Keep your pet Velkin. But this isn't over, human. Eventually, you won't have your legal protections to hide behind." "I'm not hiding behind anything," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm standing right here if you want to discuss this further." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus wasn't retreating or backing down. He was simply pointing out that any escalation would be entirely Thraxon's choice. The human's body language remained relaxed and non-threatening, but there was something in his stance that suggested he was prepared for whatever might come next. Zektar could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. The confrontation had reached a tipping point where someone would have to back down or escalate to actual violence. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds as Thraxon weighed his options. His warrior instinct screamed for immediate action, but the political complications Marcus had introduced created dangerous uncertainties. The human remained perfectly still, hands relaxed at his sides, showing no signs of aggressive posturing or defensive preparation. To most species, this would indicate submission or helplessness. Thraxians, however, had enough military history with humans to recognize something more troubling. Marcus wasn't showing submission. He was showing readiness. "You know what I find interesting about humans?" Professor Veltar, an elderly Zelanian academic, had once mentioned in a xenobiology lecture. Most species evolved their intelligence to avoid conflict. Humans evolved theirs to become better at it. Thraxon had dismissed that observation at the time, but looking at Marcus now, he began to understand what the professor meant. The human wasn't afraid because he wasn't thinking like prey. He was thinking like a predator evaluating another predator. "What are you?" Thraxon asked quietly, his earlier bluster replaced by genuine curiosity. "A student," Marcus replied simply. "Same as you, same as him." He nodded toward Zektar. "The difference is that I don't need to hurt other people to feel better about myself." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Several students in the crowd shifted uncomfortably as they recognized themselves in that description. The casual cruelty that many species accepted as natural behavior was being reframed as weakness rather than strength. "You think you understand strength?" one of the Grimaldi twins challenged. "Your species is soft. You have no natural weapons, no armor, no environmental advantages. You're barely above the Velkins in the natural order." Marcus smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Zektar felt a chill run down his spine. There was something predatory in that expression that reminded him of documentary footage he had seen of Earth's apex predators. "You're absolutely right," Marcus agreed. "Humans have no natural weapons. Do you know why?" The question hung in the air as the crowd leaned in despite themselves. "Because we became the weapon," Marcus continued conversationally. "Every species here evolved specialized advantages for their specific environments. You Grimaldi developed mineral-based physiology for your high-gravity, geologically active world. Thraxians evolved armor and mandibles for their competitive ecosystem. Velkins developed enhanced cognitive abilities for their cooperative society." He paused, looking around at the diverse crowd of students. Humans evolved on a world that had thousands of different environments, each one trying to kill us in different ways. So we didn't develop specialized advantages. We developed adaptability. We became generalists who could learn to survive anywhere, fight anything, and solve problems that specialized species couldn't even comprehend. Zektar found himself fascinated despite the tension. He had studied human evolutionary history, but hearing it explained from this perspective gave it new meaning. "More importantly," Marcus continued, "we developed something most species never needed: pack loyalty that transcends family groups. When you threaten one human, you're potentially threatening all humans. When you help one human, you're potentially helping all humans. We call it civilization. Thraxon's mandibles clicked uncertainly. You're saying other humans would come to avenge you? I'm saying other humans would come to prevent it from happening in the first place, Marcus corrected. The TDC isn't just a military force. It's a promise. A promise that no human anywhere will face overwhelming odds alone, as long as other humans exist to help them. The implications were staggering. Most species maintained military forces to protect territorial resources. The humans apparently maintained theirs to protect individual members of their species regardless of location or circumstance. That's impossible, one of the Grimaldi twins protested. No species can maintain that kind of extended support network. The logistics alone would be crippling. Would they? Marcus asked mildly. We managed to maintain educational exchanges with dozens of species, trade relationships across half the galaxy, and defensive agreements with civilizations we've only known for 15 years. Apparently, we're pretty good at logistics. Zektar realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus wasn't just defending him. He was providing a masterclass in human psychology and social organization. The human was demonstrating that strength could take forms that went far beyond physical prowess. Besides, Marcus added, his tone becoming more serious, the real question isn't whether other humans would help me. The question is whether I need them to. The courtyard went silent again as the implications of that statement sank in. Marcus wasn't claiming to be stronger than Thraxon or the Grimaldi twins. He was suggesting that strength might not be the relevant factor. Humans fought wars against each other for thousands of years, Marcus said quietly. We fought in every environment on our planet, using every conceivable weapon and tactic. We learned to kill opponents twice our size, defeat enemies with superior technology, and survive in conditions that would eliminate most life forms. He paused, letting that information settle. But more importantly, we learned when not to fight. We learned that real strength comes from building rather than destroying, from protecting rather than conquering, from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Thraxon found himself genuinely confused. Everything he understood about dominance hierarchies suggested that Marcus should either submit or escalate to violence. The human was doing neither, instead creating a completely different framework for the interaction. The watching students had grown from a handful of casual observers to nearly 100 individuals, representing dozens of species. Word of the confrontation had spread through the Academy's social networks with remarkable speed, drawing curious minds from across the station. Among them stood several older students who had remained silent during the initial bullying. A Zilanian female named Lyra stepped forward from the crowd, her crystalline features reflecting the corridor lighting in complex patterns. The human is right, she said clearly, her harmonic voice carrying across the courtyard. I've watched this happen dozens of times and I've done nothing. We've all done nothing. Her words triggered a ripple of uncomfortable shifting among the observers. Many species had evolved sophisticated social hierarchies based on strength, size, or specialized abilities. Intervention in dominance displays was typically seen as dangerous and inappropriate. This isn't your concern either, Zilanian, Thraxon warned, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Actually it is, replied Korvash, a young Altarian whose blue-scaled form had been hidden in the back of the crowd. The Velkin helped me with quantum mechanics last month when I was struggling. He spent 3 hours explaining concepts that my professor couldn't make clear. More voices began joining the conversation. Stories emerged of Zektar's quiet assistance to struggling students, his willingness to share research, his patient explanations of complex mathematical concepts. The Velkin boy had apparently been helping others for months, asking nothing in return, while suffering regular harassment in silence. He tutored me in stellar dynamics, admitted a hegemony student, whose rocky physiology made him look similar to the Grimaldi twins. Never asked for payment or favors, just helped because I needed help. Zektar looked around in amazement as more students shared similar experiences. He had never realized that his small acts of kindness had been noticed or appreciated. In his mind, helping others with their studies was simply what intelligent beings did for each other. Marcus watched the crowd dynamics shift with professional interest. Humans had been studying group psychology for centuries, and he recognized the signs of a social tipping point. The crowd was no longer a collection of passive observers. It was becoming a community with shared values. This is what civilization looks like, Marcus said, addressing Thraxon directly. Not the biggest person dominating everyone else, but everyone working together to make life better for all of them. Thraxon's compound eyes swept across the growing crowd of students who were now openly expressing support for the Velkin boy. His earlier confidence was evaporating as he realized that the social dynamics had shifted completely against him. "You're weak," he said to Marcus, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Maybe," Marcus replied calmly, "but I'm not alone." The simple statement carried profound implications. In most animal societies, individual strength determined survival and reproduction success, but humans had somehow transcended that limitation by creating networks of mutual support that made individual strength less relevant than group cooperation. The Galactic Council was founded on these principles, Lyra added, her crystalline form chiming softly as she spoke. Cooperation over competition, knowledge over force, mutual aid over individual dominance. Professor Hesteron, an elderly Calorian who had been observing from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with the careful dignity of advanced age. His 6 arms moved in complex patterns as he spoke, adding emphatic gestures to his words. "In my 40 years at this academy," he said in a voice like rustling leaves, "I have seen the rise and fall of many social orders among the students. The ones that endure are always those based on mutual respect and shared purpose." The professor's intervention was significant. Faculty members rarely involve themselves in student social dynamics, preferring to let young beings work out their own hierarchies. His willingness to speak publicly suggested that the situation had escalated beyond normal parameters. "Thraxon," Professor Hesteron continued, "your family has a proud military tradition, but true warriors protect those who cannot protect themselves. They do not prey upon them." The Thraxian's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this unexpected challenge to his behavior from a respected authority figure. In Thraxian culture, elder approval was crucial for social standing, and Professor Hesteron was one of the most respected academics in the academy. Thraxon began, then stopped as he realized he had no explanation that would sound reasonable to the growing crowd. "You were just what?" asked Senna, a young Vegan whose telepathic abilities made lies impossible in her presence. "Teaching him respect, showing him his place, helping him understand the natural order." Each question hung in the air like an accusation. The crowd was no longer neutral. They had clearly chosen sides, and Thraxon found himself increasingly isolated. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out across the Thraxian's features. Everything in Thraxon's evolutionary and cultural programming told him to escalate the confrontation, to reassert dominance through force, but the social and political consequences of such action were becoming increasingly clear. "This is what happens when different species try to coexist," one of the Grimaldi twins muttered. "Natural hierarchies get disrupted by artificial social rules." "Natural hierarchies?" Lyra's harmonic voice took on a sharp edge. "Is it natural for 3 large students to torment one small one? Is that the kind of nature you want to represent?" The question struck home because they forced the bullies to articulate their philosophy explicitly. When their actions were framed as entertainment or dominance display, they seemed reasonable within certain cultural contexts. When framed as systematic cruelty, they became much harder to defend. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture, where words would either diffuse the situation or escalate it beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Thraxon stood surrounded by over 100 students who had made their position clear, while his 2 Grimaldi companions shifted nervously as they realized their entertainment had become something much more serious. Marcus could see the internal war playing out in Thraxon's body language. The Thraxian's natural instincts demanded a violent response to challenge his authority, but his intelligence was beginning to process the broader implications of his situation. "Thraxon," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer." The Thraxian's compound eyes focused on the human with wary attention. "What do you want to be remembered for when you leave this academy?" Marcus continued. "Do you want to be remembered as the student who terrorized others for entertainment? Or do you want to be remembered as someone who used his strength to make this place better for everyone?" The question was unexpected and deeply personal. Most challenges focused on immediate power dynamics or social status. Marcus was asking Thraxon to consider his legacy, his long-term impact on the community around him. Thraxon began, then stopped as he realized he had never seriously considered that question before. Zektar watched this exchange with fascination. The human wasn't trying to humiliate Thraxon or force him into submission. Instead, Marcus was offering the Thraxian a path toward redemption that would allow him to save face while changing his behavior. In Thraxian military tradition, Professor Hesteron added gently, the greatest warriors are those who win battles without fighting them. Perhaps this is an opportunity to demonstrate that kind of excellence. The professor's words provided Thraxon with a cultural framework for understanding Marcus's offer. Instead of being forced to abandon his warrior identity, he was being invited to express it in a more sophisticated way. Your strength is obvious, Marcus continued. Everyone here can see that you could defeat any of us in physical combat, but real strength is knowing when not to use force. Real strength is using your advantages to protect others instead of exploiting them. Lyra stepped forward, her crystalline form chiming softly as she moved. Thraxon, you have natural leadership abilities. Students listen when you speak. They respect your opinions. They follow your example. You could use those gifts to make this academy a better place for everyone. The Zelanian's words highlighted something that Thraxon had always known, but never fully considered. His size and presence made him influential among the student body, but he had been using that influence for destructive purposes rather than constructive ones. What are you suggesting? Thraxon asked, his voice uncertain but no longer aggressive. I'm suggesting that you become part of the solution instead of part of the problem, Marcus replied. Help us create an environment where students like Zektar can focus on learning instead of surviving. The crowd waited in tense silence as Thraxon considered this proposal. Several students had their recording devices ready, knowing that whatever happened next would likely be shared across the Academy's social networks within minutes. Zektar found himself holding his breath. For months, he had endured systematic harassment with no hope that anything would change. Now, for the first time, he was seeing the possibility of a different kind of social order, one based on cooperation rather than dominance. The Grimaldi Empire teaches that strength serves strength, one of the twins said quietly to Thraxon, but maybe strength could serve something greater than itself. His brother nodded slowly. The human has a point. We've been using our abilities to make others miserable. That's not strength, that's just cruelty. The admission from his companions seemed to tip the balance for Thraxon. He looked around at the assembled students, seeing them not as an audience for his dominance display, but as a community he could choose to join or alienate. Thraxon paused, his mandibles clicking as he struggled to find words for concepts he had never needed to express before. I didn't think about it that way. That's okay, Marcus said gently. None of us were born knowing how to build better communities. We all have to learn. The human's willingness to include himself in that statement was crucial. He wasn't claiming moral superiority or demanding submission. Instead, he was acknowledging that everyone, including himself, was part of an ongoing learning process. What would you want me to do? Thraxon asked, and the simple question marked a fundamental shift in the entire dynamic. Start by apologizing to Zektar, Lyra suggested, then maybe help him get to his class on time. Thraxon looked down at the small Velkan boy who had been the target of his harassment. Zektar met his gaze without flinching, though his large dark eyes still held traces of fear. I'm sorry, Thraxon said, his voice carrying the rumbling authority that made it audible throughout the courtyard. What I did was wrong. You don't deserve to be treated that way. Zektar nodded slowly, accepting the apology with the grace that came from understanding how difficult it must have been for a proud warrior to offer it. Thank you, Zektar replied simply. I forgive you. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate crisis resolved, but many students lingered to continue conversations that had been sparked by the confrontation. New friendships were forming, study groups were being organized, and social barriers that had seemed permanent were beginning to dissolve. 3 months later, The changes that had begun in that courtyard confrontation had rippled throughout Galactic Academy Station 7 in ways no one could have predicted. The incident had been recorded by dozens of students and shared across the Academy's networks, eventually reaching administrators, faculty, and even some Galactic Council education committees. Zektar sat in the central study area, surrounded by an unlikely collection of students from various species. His quantum mechanics study group had grown from a desperate attempt to catch up on missed classes to one of the most sought-after academic resources on the station. The Velkin's patient teaching style and deep understanding of complex mathematical concepts had made him something of a celebrity among struggling students. "Still don't understand how you make tensor calculus look so simple," complained Vera, a young Altarian whose blue scales shifted color with her frustration. "It's not simple," Zektar replied gently, his large dark eyes reflecting the data displays floating around their table. "It's just a matter of breaking complex problems into smaller, more manageable pieces. Everything becomes easier when you understand the fundamental patterns." Marcus looked up from his own studies at a nearby table, smiling as he watched Zektar work with the other students. The transformation in the young Velkin had been remarkable. The frightened, isolated boy who had crawled for his scattered papers had evolved into a confident teacher and valued community member. "Chen," Thraxon's booming voice echoed across the study area as the massive Thoraxian approached Marcus's table. "The disciplinary committee wants to see us." Over the past months, Thraxon had become an unlikely ally in Marcus's efforts to create a more inclusive academy environment. The Thoraxian's natural leadership abilities, once directed toward bullying and intimidation, had been redirected toward protecting vulnerable students and mediating conflicts. "What did we do this time?" Marcus asked with mock concern. "Apparently, the hegemony students have been complaining about our interference in traditional dominance hierarchies," Thraxon replied, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "They claim we're disrupting the natural order." Marcus gathered his materials and stood up. "I suppose we should go explain ourselves." As they walked toward the administrative sections, Thraxon reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that confrontation in the courtyard. His transformation from bully to protector had not been easy, requiring him to examine and reject many of the assumptions he had grown up with. "Do you ever regret it?" Thraxon asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Standing up that day. Getting involved. You could have just walked away and avoided all the complications." Marcus considered the question seriously as they made their way through the station's corridors. The past months had indeed been complicated. The incident had triggered administrative reviews, policy changes, and ongoing tensions with species whose cultures emphasized traditional dominance hierarchies. "No," Marcus said finally. "I don't regret it, do you?" "No," Thraxon replied without hesitation. "I feel like I've finally started to understand what real strength means." The disciplinary committee meeting was relatively brief. Committee Chair Velthara, an elderly Calorian whose purple skin bore the intricate scarification patterns of high academic rank, had called them in to discuss the Academy's new anti-harassment protocols. "The measures you students have implemented have been remarkably effective," she said, her 6 arms moving in complex approval gestures. "Reported incidents of bullying have decreased by 73%. Academic performance across all species has improved significantly, and student satisfaction surveys show the highest levels in Academy history." Marcus and Thraxon exchanged glances. They had expected criticism, not praise. "However," Velthara continued, "we have received formal complaints from several species representatives who claim that these changes interfere with traditional cultural practices and natural social development." "What kind of complaints?" Thraxon asked, his voice taking on the protective edge that had become familiar to anyone who threatened students under his informal protection. "Primarily concerns that preventing dominance, displays, and physical intimidation will leave young beings unprepared for the realities of interspecies politics and commerce," Velthara explained. "They argue that learning to navigate power hierarchies is an essential life skill." Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "And what's the committee's position on those complaints?" "The committee's position," Velthara said with what might have been a smile on her alien features, "is that the Academy's mission is to prepare students for the galaxy we want to create, not the galaxy we inherited from our ancestors." The meeting concluded with official recognition of the student-led initiatives that had emerged from that day in the courtyard. Marcus and Thraxon's informal mediation program was being formalized with faculty support. Zektar's tutoring network was receiving official academic credit. The peer support systems that had developed organically were being studied for implementation at other academy stations. As they walked back toward the study areas, Thraxon reflected on the broader implications of what they had accomplished. "Do you think this will last?" he asked Marcus. "Or will everything go back to the old ways once we graduate?" "That depends on the students who come after us," Marcus replied. "Change isn't something that happens once and then stays fixed. It's something each generation has to choose for themselves." They found Zektar still working with his study group, but now the circle included several species that had never interacted peacefully before. A young Thraxian female was collaborating with a Grimaldi student on stellar engineering problems, while a group of Velkans and Altarians shared research on quantum field theory. "You know what I find most interesting about all this?" Zektar said later as the three unlikely friends reviewed the day's events. "What's that?" Marcus asked. "Before that day in the courtyard, I thought strength and intelligence were separate things, that you could be one or the other, but not both. Now I understand that real intelligence includes knowing how to use strength wisely, and real strength includes having the wisdom to know when not to use it." Marcus smiled, remembering his own words from months earlier about humans becoming the weapon rather than developing natural weapons. Maybe that's what civilization really means. Not the absence of strength, but strength guided by wisdom and compassion. Thraxon nodded slowly, his massive frame somehow seeming less intimidating than it had months earlier. "In Thoraxian tradition, we have a saying, 'The greatest victory is the one that requires no battle.' I never understood what that meant until now." As the Academy's artificial night cycle began and students prepared for rest, the three friends looked out through the viewing ports at the stars beyond. Somewhere among those distant points of light were worlds where their species had once been enemies, where natural hierarchies and evolutionary advantages had determined the fate of entire civilizations. But here, in this small corner of the galaxy, they had proven that intelligence, compassion, and cooperation could create something better than the sum of their individual strengths. They had shown that evolution's greatest achievement wasn't the development of claws, armor, or size, but the capacity to choose kindness over cruelty, community over dominance, and hope over fear. The future of galactic civilization would be shaped by countless choices made by countless individuals. But in this moment, in this place, three young beings from different worlds had chosen to build something better together than any of them could have created alone. And that, perhaps, was the most human thing of all.